It's time for us to begin. Cody mentioned to me last week we thought we'd introduce for Travis for Bible class this morning. From Houston, Texas comes Travis with us. He's going to be teaching our Bible class. There is some flyers that he's put out electronically through Cody, but there's also some flyers in the back if you would like. We got a couple of men that'd probably be glad to get you one if you'd just like an outline of what he's going to be covering in Bible classes this morning. And but anyway, Travis Wise from Houston, Texas is at least interested in our work enough to come all the way from Houston, and we're thankful for him. I told him we really appreciate the work that he does already just because of the truth that he stands for. So at this time, I want to give you Travis Wise teaching our Bible class. Thank you, Travis.
It's good to be with you guys today, and good morning. Turn your Bibles over to Matthew 4. We're going to be centered on this text today, and really I want to use it as, this is a very familiar text. It's on the temptation of Jesus, something probably most of us are very familiar with, and I want to look at it in maybe a new way that we haven't always thought about, but is lying underneath the surface of the text here. So Matthew chapter 4. So some of you already know already. Me and Tyler and I, we went to college together at SFA, and we were good friends. And he was in the communication department. I was in the history field. I mean, my degree was in history, so I guess I just like history. And when you talk about history, everybody's heard that phrase that history repeats itself. History repeats itself. And I actually like the way that Mark Twain put it. Mark Twain's little quote was that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. In other words, I mean, I really like that quote because it holds this tension and balance with history. When you think about history, whether it's biblical history or whether it's just history in general, history, it doesn't quite repeat itself in the sense that it's just this one unending circle that just loops back over and over on itself, and we're just endlessly repeating the same stuff over and over. But at the same time, history is not quite a line going from point A to point B with just complete change and no repetition or anything like that. There's kind of this rhyme that happens with history. If you can imagine it being kind of like this line, we realize that history is going to something, that there's going to be a concluding event when Jesus returns. But in the meantime, history, we're kind of living this history where we can live 2,000 years after Christ, but we look back to when Jesus was living and we're thinking, boy, I mean, we have a lot more technology now, but people still do some of the same really foolish stuff. People still make some of the same really bad mistakes. And at the same time, there's times in our lives or times when we observe other people's lives that we say, boy, that was an event that they showed some of the courage like Joshua or like others. And I don't think that this should be a surprise that history is kind of like this, that it's not just chaos, that there's some type of order to history, that we can look back and see that, hey, this event that I'm living right now, it's similar to what I've lived in the past. Because, of course, God's in control of history, and God's a God of order and not chaos. And even in the Bible, this is something that we see over and over again, that it can surprise us, that we see these repetitions or these rhymes happening when we read our Bible. And we read a story and we think, boy, I think this has happened before. I mean, not with the exact same people, not in the exact same way, but something like this has happened before. And the Bible's trying to tell us something about how to understand, read this story in light of what had happened before. So let me give you, and I know if you had gotten a chance to read, just that, I put some thought questions on that sheet that I sent out, just to give you an idea about what we would be talking about. And I'll ask in a second if y'all had thought of things like that in the Bible, but let me give you two examples of how this rhyme happens throughout the Bible. There are the water crossers and the mountain climbers in the Bible. The water crossers and mountain climbers. So let me talk about the water crossers in the Bible. In the Bible, in the biblical world, water is a very, very scary thing. I mean, it's kind of like outer space is for us today. water is pretty much uncharted in the biblical world. I mean, the best that you can do is just take a boat out onto the water. But you know, if you fall in, you just fall and fall and fall, and you don't know where that bottom is of that water, and there's no way that you can get anything that falls in there. In the same way, outer space for us is kind of uncharted. And we also recognize that if anything comes out of outer space, in a movie or whatever it is up to no good. E.T. aside and all of that stuff. And in the same way, within the Bible, when we read the Bible, there's these scenes, whether it's in Revelation or in the book of Daniel, just for example, there are these beasts coming out of the water, and you know that they're up to no good before you even hear more about them, because they're coming out of this water that's dark and dangerous. The water is scary within the ancient world. And so when anybody conquers the water, it's a big event, and it's a sign that God is behind this person. So, of course, Moses is this big water crosser within the Bible. Moses, if you remember, he has his back against the water, and Pharaoh and his army is coming against him. And Moses, of course, splits the Red Sea, and it's the sign that God is with him. And he goes across on dry land, and it falls on Pharaoh's army. After Moses dies, the big question is, who is going to lead God's people? And God says, I'm going to be with you, Joshua. And one of the initial signs that shows that God is with Joshua is they cross the Jordan. The water stops and they go across it. And this continues on through the Bible. Anytime we see these water crossing events, we're meant to think, okay, this guy's a big deal. He's a prophet, kind of like Moses was. So you see Elijah and Elisha, the same thing happens to them. They cross water where normally they wouldn't have been able to cross. It's a sign that God is with them. And flash forward into the New Testament. You have Jesus, who on a dark and stormy night on Galilee, when the disciples are out on a boat, Jesus, he doesn't split water. He walks on top of the water. And so we're meant to think about all of these things that had happened previously in the Bible of these water crossers, and to think, boy, Jesus is the real thing. This is something bigger than Moses and Elijah is right here. This also happens, let me give you just one more example. This also happens with the mountain climbers in the Bible. You have, within the Bible, the mountains are typically a place where you can find God. It's kind of where there's this idea that God dwells on a mountain. Eden itself seemed to be on a mountain. It was at a place, it doesn't say that it was on a mountain literally, but it was at a place where their four rivers ran away from it. That only happens on top of a mountain. Jerusalem itself was built on a mountain, and you see this on Mount Zion. You see this throughout the Bible. So the mountain is where that typically you would find God. And so when you see Moses climbing up a mountain for the Ten Commandments, you're supposed to be thinking, okay, something big's going to happen. He's going to see God. And of course he does. He sees God's glory and gets the Ten Commandments. Elijah, this happens too. He goes up that same mountain much later in the history, and he sees God's glory pass before him, and that still quiet voice, if you remember. And then back in flashing forward again to the New Testament, this rhyme, this repetition of history happens because one day Jesus, with a few of his chosen apostles, he goes up a mountain, and immediately before anything happens, we're supposed to be thinking, okay, when Moses went up a mountain and when Elijah went up a mountain, they saw God's glory. But something phenomenal happens, of course, when Jesus goes up the mountain. He doesn't see God's glory. He becomes God's glory. He's transfigured. And everybody around it sees it and knows that, wow, this is something big. This is something new. And it's no surprise that, of course, who else is on that mountain with him? It's Moses and Elijah, those two other mountain climbers. So throughout the Bible, there's this kind of rhyming throughout the Bible that different stories are meant to call us back to other events because they're making a bigger point. In Jesus' case, in each of these instances, it's the fact that God is with him, and this is something much bigger than anybody who had come before. And so as we come to Matthew 4, I want to look at this event in light of all of that. And let me ask you a question. I'm just curious. I mean, those were the mountain climbers and water crossers were just two events I had thought of. Had anybody else given thought to other events kind of like this, where there are these repetitions or rhymes?
I enjoyed your questions. I thought they were kind of thought-provoking. Lambs and shepherds was the thing that mostly hits me. All the way back to Cain and Abel, and Moses and Isaac, and David, and major person who's a shepherd. And in every dispensation, lambs are sacrifices. But by the time you get to Jesus, he's the shepherd and the lamb. And so, to me, coming from a background kind of in art, we call this sort of thing a motif.
Yeah.
It just recurs, or like in a piece of music, or in a movie. When you hear a certain theme, you know this character is coming on the scene because it's affiliated with them. And so those things crop up all the time. And it shows that it was designed. It wasn't just random happenings. It's not just a book of laws. It's a composition.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very good point.
Numbers. I see numbers repeating itself.
Yeah, like absolutely. No, you're right. I mean, so like numbers, and this is part of the reason that numbers are a big part of the Bible. Just for example, to your point, when Jesus picks 12 apostles, he didn't. That's not just a random thing. He didn't just say, "Hey, we're at 11. We're one more, or maybe we'll get to 13 if I can just find another one." 12 was representative of this is Jesus is starting something new. God had 12 tribes of Israel, and now Jesus himself picks 12 apostles that is representative that this new kingdom is starting now. I mean, we're turning the page on something new and building something that hasn't been built already. So very good point there as well.
As you was talking about the mountaintops, this popped in my mind. But to add to the mountaintops, didn't Paul receive his knowledge on top of Mount Sinai as well? Or he was called up, because he was not taught by men. He was not taught by the apostles. He received it directly from Jesus, did he not? And I think it's on top of a mountain.
Yeah, it's. When you say that, I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians, then of 2 Corinthians with the thorn in the flesh. Well, he talks about being lifted into the third heaven. But I'd have to look at that. But yeah, I mean, like all of these things. I mean, they're throughout the Bible. There are all these callbacks, and a lot of times it's important to look at things on the surface, but sometimes there's things going on underneath as well. And so let's.
Well, there's certainly all through that over and over again, and it may not be the kind that you're thinking about. But in Judges, you have apostasy, a deliverer, redeemer, repentance, and then falling away. And that's constant throughout the Bible. Israel was brought back to God. They would sin. God would send one. He sent the ultimate redeemer, and man has the chance to repent. But very often we fall back. So there's definitely a cycle there. But also you have Joseph became the most powerful man in Egypt. When he was a child, you would never have begun to think that Joseph is going to be the most powerful ruler in Egypt. He was from a relatively minor family in a very small place. David became the greatest ruler of Israel. He was a shepherd, and his family was it was a very small family. He considered himself a small family. And in Christ, you certainly would not think would be the ultimate king, coming from his beginnings and his parents. So you have those three kingdoms definitely have relationships to each other.
Yeah, very good point. Let's keep on going. To your point, the cycle within the Judges. I mean, that's one of the things that made me think of it more than anything. I mean, years ago that happened, and that happens even. I mean, we see it even in Christian history that they have the gospel. There's this calling to God, this repentance, but then there are some that go into apostasy and fall away. It's this kind of unending circle that seems to happen. Let's go to Matthew 4, because this is what I really want to spend our time with today. I mean, especially after that introduction. This is a rich story. I mean, we're very familiar with it, but there's so much going on underneath it as well. And so let me just start off from the very beginning. Chapter 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Before we even get into the story, like the full text of Matthew 4, there's something going on, and it's immediately asking us to go back in history. It's reminding us of something else that's happened. Where else have we seen someone coming up out of the water, because he has just been baptized, coming up out of the water, being led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested for 40 days? We haven't exactly seen that. But if we change some of the stuff around, if we realize that something else is going on, if we think of a people that come up out of the water and are led by the Spirit or a cloud into the desert, into the wilderness, not for 40 days, but for 40 years to be tested, it's immediately making us think back to Israel. And one of the things that we realize is that Israel messed up. Israel messed up big time. And that's part of the reason they spent 40 years in the wilderness. But as we go through this text of Matthew 4, every one of the passages that Jesus quotes to Satan, it's drawn from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the book at the end of this wilderness wandering. And it's kind of this sign going on that Israel messed up. Israel was supposed to be a blessing to the nations around them, but they became like the nations around them. And instead of blessing them, instead of ultimately converting them or bringing them into God's kingdom, they became a curse themselves and became like the nations around them. And Jesus, by seeing this, as was mentioned earlier, there's this motif of being baptized, going into the wilderness for 40 days to be tested. He succeeds in all of the ways that Israel fails. And it's this sign, before we even see in the story that Jesus is going to, in history, that Jesus is going to die on the cross and be resurrected, it's this sign that something new is happening here. And where Israel messed up, God's plan isn't going to be messed up just because a nation can't get it right. This is the Jesus that's ultimately going to fulfill what Israel was their job initially to do. But Jesus is going to succeed in all the ways that Israel failed, to be a blessing to the nations, to fulfill Abraham's promises. Let's keep on going on. In verse 3, and the tempter came and said to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." The first temptation, just a quick note on that. Each of these temptations, there's something interesting going on as well. As we read through it, recognize these temptations, initially, Satan he seems to be pushing, almost sizing up Jesus a little bit, until towards the very end, he just cuts right down to the heart of it. I mean, we're familiar with that last temptation, bow down and worship me. But right now, he's just kind of pushing on Jesus. Okay, if you're the Son of God, just prove it, show me, turn these stones into bread. And as these temptations, they intensify, one of the things that's going to happen as well within the story, Satan is going to lead Jesus to a higher and to a higher place, just as these temptations are intensifying. But in this initial one, Satan pushes on Jesus a little bit, and Jesus, of course, is fasting. So first of all, to turn it into bread, to eat of that, would be a violation of the days that he's meant to spend in fasting and in meditation to God. But on top of that as well, I think we've probably heard this, that it would be really a violation of everything that Jesus came to earth to essentially say, thy will be done, not my will be done. And by turning a stone into bread would show a lack of faith in God being the one that provides his sustenance, and Jesus basically just trusting in himself to provide for himself. But it goes on in verse 5. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." And so in this next temptation, in the second temptation, there's two interesting things that are going on. First of all, this is the one temptation that Satan actually quotes scriptures to Jesus. So we recognize just because you can quote the Bible doesn't mean that you're applying it the right way. But the other thing that's going on is Satan kind of turns the question a little bit this time. He asks Jesus to throw himself off and let God save him. In other words, Jesus knows that the question is about whether I'm going to be faithful to God. But Satan's trying to twist that around and asking Jesus, is God going to be faithful to you? Try it out. You put God to the test. You're the one being Jesus is the one being tested here, but Satan says, no. You need to put God to the test. You need to make sure that he actually cares for you and he cares about you. And the reason I want to emphasize these things, we're going to see each of these temptations crop up in an earlier story that I want to go back to. But it goes on. In verse 7, Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your..." Well, I already read that. Verse 8, "Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, Begone, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him." So in this final temptation, whatever, I mean, there was never any innocence about Satan, but whatever not just outright evil like you could see in some of those temptations, they were pushing Jesus, and they were wrong, but Satan doesn't really just completely drop his disguise until this final one where he shows Jesus that I'm the one in control of things here, and if you just bow down to me, then you can have all of this. And in other words, he's offering Jesus immediate gratification. Jesus knows that the only way to redemption of the world is through the cross. And Satan's trying to give him a shortcut, trying to say, go this way instead of the hard way that you know that you need to go. And of course, Jesus sees through it and denies Satan a final time, and Satan, at least for the moment, goes off. And so, as I said before, this story is a rich all in itself, the temptation of Jesus, and we're very familiar with it. But there's something else going on beneath the surface. And it's not only the temptation of the Israelites in the wilderness, but it's calling us back to a very, very early story, way, way back in the Bible. Because you know what? This is the first time that Satan has slithered up to Jesus to tempt him directly, at least that we see. But it's not the first time that Satan has slithered up to someone. It's not even the first time that he slithered up to someone who's called a son of God and tempted them. And of course, the story I'm thinking about is all the way back in Genesis 3. It really the beginning of our Bibles. So Genesis 3. Genesis 3. So immediately, I think we're familiar with this. It's the temptation of Eve, where Eve and Adam are going to eat of the fruit. And even before we start reading into the text here, when we're thinking of the temptation of Jesus, there's already a lot of similarities and also some big differences as well that should be in our mind. There's 1,000+ chapters in the Bible, and by my count, there's only 2 in which Satan pops up to tempt man face to face, or woman. There's only 2 places, 2 chapters out of the 1,000+ chapters in the Bible, and Satan comes up in other places, but there's only 2 places where he comes up to tempt man face to face. And the similarities just keep on going. Both of the Bibles, the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's kind of funny that both of them open up this way, right? And in fact, in both Genesis and Matthew, it's how the Bible opens up. You're only 3 chapters in Genesis when Satan pops up, and you're 4 chapters in Matthew when it pops up. And in both of these, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and each time, God is starting something new. He started something new with the world and Adam, and Satan comes in there to mess it up. And the same thing seems to be happening in Matthew, that as soon as God has sent Jesus into the world, Satan pops up onto the scene to try to mess up something. And between Jesus and Adam, I mentioned, we know that Jesus is the Son of God. Adam, of course, is called the Son of God as well. So both in the book of Luke, and you don't have to go here, but in Luke 3:38, just for example, when they're going through the genealogies, it ends with Adam, a son of God. He had no earthly father. Granted, he's a son of God in a very different way than Jesus is, but he was created by God with no other father or mother. And Jesus and Adam are similar in this type of respect. Paul makes this connection as well in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45. He calls Jesus the last Adam. In other words, Paul's point there is the first Adam really messed things up within the world through his sin and giving in to Satan. But Jesus is the one who, he's not going to make the same mistakes that Adam did. And he didn't make the same mistakes that Adam did through all of this. So there's these similarities that are going on right at the beginning. But of course, the differences are what really hit us as well. Because Satan shows up in a garden to tempt Adam and Eve. But in Jesus' time, there's not any Garden of Eden anymore. And in fact, gardens as a whole, they seem to be a little bit less prevalent. There's a lot more deserts in the world. This is part of the result of the curse in Genesis 3, that the ground is not going to be as fertile, and there's going to be a lot more thorns and thistles and dust just throughout the earth. And so there's this big contrast, whereas Adam and Eve somehow fail and listen to Satan in a garden where God had already provided everything that they ever wanted. Jesus is in a desert where he's been fasting. He doesn't have every single thing that he wanted, but he's standing up against Satan, who's tempting him in this place. The garden as well, and another kind of difference here, similarity. The garden, it's no surprise that Satan shows up in the garden to tempt Adam and Eve. He knew where to find Adam and Eve. He knew that the garden was where God dwelt in Genesis 3. And in a very similar fashion, in a very similar fashion, when Jesus shows up in the desert, I don't think it's an accident that Satan shows up. In fact, Matthew 4, verse 1, it says, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. It wasn't an accident that Jesus is fasting in the desert and Satan just pops up. That seems to be the intent that underlied the Spirit leading him into the wilderness. And we know this. This is you see this in a few places within the Bible, where the garden is where God dwelt. The desert, oftentimes, like Leviticus 16 and 17 is a place that you can find some of this, and other places scattered about. The deserts were often associated with evil things and demons and bad, evil forces, and that's why you didn't want to be out in the desert. You wanted to be part of society or the camp in some type of way. And so it's not any type of surprise that Jesus is going out into the desert in that type of scene to be tempted by Satan. And I think part of what's going on is it's again this idea that Adam messed up, but Jesus, he's confronting Satan right at the beginning of his ministry to essentially put him on notice, to say things aren't going to happen like they did thousands of years before with Adam. Something new is happening, and your time's about to be up. But let's read Genesis 3 real quick and make some of the other comparisons while we're still here. So Genesis 3, verse 1, Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, Did God actually say, You shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And we know the rest of the story. God finds them in the garden. Not only do they fall under a curse, but the world itself falls under a curse, and they're expelled from Eden, and the world itself, just ever since the fall, it just doesn't work the way it used to. It's kind of like that toy that you broke that you try to fix for your kids, but it's just, you're not going to glue this back together in the right type of way. And we live in a broken and fallen world ever since this. But thinking about Jesus' temptations, I mean, there's kind of a few ways we can look at it. Funny enough, I mean, we think Jesus was tempted 3 times. And what was the first temptation? It was food that he wasn't supposed to eat, which is, it's calling us back again to Genesis 3. That's what Eve is tempted with, food that she's not supposed to eat. And of course, you could say on one end, Eve just messes that up on the first time so that it doesn't get around to a second and third temptation. in the same way it does with Jesus. But when we look at some of the things that Jesus is saying, they're very similar to what's going on with Jesus. If we think about Jesus, that second temptation, throw yourself down from the temple, Satan changes the question. When the question at the whole time should have been about whether Jesus is going to be faithful, Satan tries to make the question about whether God is going to be faithful and whether God's going to be the one that loves you and cares for you. And he does the same thing here in chapter 3. He says in verse 5, Satan says, God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This is Satan's response to Eve. In other words, he tries to twist Eve around. Eve knows I'm not supposed to touch. Well, God never even said don't touch the tree. I mean, Eve made that up herself, but he said don't eat from the tree. And she knows that, but Satan twisted around, essentially saying it's not about whether you should not eat of the tree. All of this is about God, and he's not being right with you. He's the bad guy here, not you. He just doesn't want you to be like him. He's the selfish one. Satan changes the question about who's supposed to be faithful in this scenario. And that third temptation, of course, is right underneath all of it. That third temptation that he offers Jesus, this immediate gratification that just bow down to me and you'll have control over all the earth, over all the nations of the earth. That immediate gratification, of course, is underlying the whole tree. That if Eve, all she needs to do is eat this fruit and she'll be like God. She has it. She doesn't have to wait on God to give her wisdom, just waiting for it, but she just has to eat of it and she'll be right there. So there are these similarities that go through that each time when we read the temptation of Jesus, it's so rich. Again, there's all kinds of ways that we can explore it, but one of the things it's asking us to do is look back at the very beginning when God created the world. And Jesus is doing something new now. The world's been broken and fallen since Adam and Eve, but Jesus now, he's going to do something else. Satan slithered into Eden to tempt Adam and Eve, but you have Jesus being led by the Spirit right into almost, it seems like, the dwelling place of Satan. It wasn't an accident that Satan shows up, but right towards Satan to be tempted to show that things aren't going to happen the way that they did before. I'm the last Adam. Things are going to be happening differently. I'm the one that people can put their hope in. I'm the one that's going to be an example for people that follow. For us as Christians, of course, it's a sign of hope. It's a sign that, and we see this through the rest of the Gospels, that Jesus is victorious in all of these types of ways, ultimately in not only his death, but in his resurrection, his defeat of death. That's the sign that even though we ultimately will die, that death will be defeated when Jesus returns, and Satan once and for all will finally be defeated. All the heavy lifting stuff with the cross has been done. We're just doing the cleanup work right now. But the question for us, of course, is as Christians, history hasn't stopped rhyming or stopped repeating just because we're outside of the Bible. I mean, Revelation, of course, closes the Bible, but in a sense, even though none of us, my name's not going to be written down in any history book anywhere, but we're written in the book of life. We're still part of God's story. We're still living out God's promises. We're still living out spreading the word of the kingdom. So the question, of course, for us is, what does this teach us? Am I going to go the way of Adam and Eve, or do I go the way of Adam? And there's a few points of application I just want to hit on before we close, but let me open it up just a little bit real quick before I finish out. Comments or questions, or just applications to this?
While you were talking, I was thinking of Eve and Mary, because Mary is sort of the redemption of Eve. She gives the right answers. When God tells her she's going to have a child and she's a virgin, she's like, okay, I'm your handmaid, do whatever you're going to do. And she's faithful. So she brings that verse 15 to pass.
And thank you for mentioning those. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that's going on. In verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So it's, good point with Mary, and then, of course, within the temptation of Jesus. This is, when Jesus shows up and he succeeds in all the places that Adam failed, this is This is kind of the doomsday scenario for Satan. He knows his time is starting to wind down.
And repeat again, 1 John 2, verse 16 tells us, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life. Those are the three ways Christ was tempted, and the three ways that Eve was tempted. They saw it, and they were told what it would do for them, as opposed to God, and then the immediate gratification.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll continue on. And thank you for the comments. In terms of application, I mean, the question, of course, is always open to us. Am I going to follow the way of Adam and Eve, or I follow the way of Christ? And this crops up in other ways as well, in other biblical stories. I mean, am I going to be like Noah in this situation, or am I going to be like Lot's wife, and on and on and on? I think 3 points that we can draw from this. I think first of all is that one immediate application, I'll say, is that you spot the fake thing by studying the real thing. You spot the fake thing by studying the real thing. You see this with Jesus, first of all. I mean, every time Satan comes to him, even when he comes to him by quoting the Psalms to him and quoting the Bible, the Scripture to Jesus, Jesus always knows where to go within the Bible to show that Satan is in the wrong here. And I don't know. My guess is that Jesus probably didn't have a cheat sheet on any of this, but he knew how to respond every single time to when Satan asks him a question or tempts him, because he knew his Scripture. Whereas on the other hand, Eve, she doesn't really even know what God says, because I kind of mentioned this in passing. I mean, she says in chapter 3, verse 3. She quotes God as saying that neither shall you touch it lest you die. I mean, that might be good advice, but it wasn't what God said. And if Eve can't even remember what God had commanded them, it's kind of no surprise that she ends up messing up in all of it. And for us as Christians, I think there's always going to be something going on out in the world in terms of doctrine or false doctrine or apostasy, whatever name you want to call it. And in fact, if you go back through the now 2,000 plus years of Christian history, there's all kinds of apostasies. There's all kinds of apostasies that we don't even know the names of anymore because we've forgotten it. There's all kinds of ways that you can go wrong, but there's really only one way that you can go right. And so for us, you spot the fake thing by knowing the real thing. As Christians, we always need to be centered in Scripture. And every once in a while, I mean, as things come up, there might be things that are not right that we need to look into, but that should never be our focus or our fascination. But our focus and our fascination should always be the Word of God, because that's going to be able to clue us in when things come up that aren't quite right. And second of all, I think one of the things, we see this within the second temptation that I mentioned, when Satan turns the question on Jesus, and he says it's not, he says it's the question, Satan tries to make the question, is God going to be faithful to you? When the question the whole time is Jesus going to be faithful to God? And so for us, I think it's a big one as well, we always need to realize the question is always, am I going to be faithful to God? It's not a question of whether God's going to be faithful to me. I mean, we can. I mean, if we're standing and sitting here today, we can probably think we'd need more fingers on our hands to think of all the instances in which God has either answered prayers or been there for us or cared for us or taken care of us or blessed us in ways which we never really deserved. We know that God's been faithful to us. And if we aren't sure of that, we can also look back at the Bible about how often God's been faithful to his people and how ultimately he will be faithful in Jesus' return. But the hard part is when difficult times come and when bad things happen to us, what's our immediate reaction so often? We start thinking, where's God? Why did God let this happen? Why is God doing this? Instead of thinking that, hey, maybe I'm the one here that's being tested. Maybe I'm the one here that needs to show how faithful I'm going to be. We immediately change the question and we want to make it about, where's God? Why isn't he doing something? Why won't he come right now? And because of that, in prayer, so and we'll actually even talk about this a little bit this evening, you see in the Psalms that David will call out, God, where are you? Where are you? Help me now. But if that's the only thing that we think of, and that's the only question that we ask, and if that's the immediate question that we ask that clouds out the fact that maybe I'm the one that's being tested here, maybe I need to be faithful to God while I'm going through hard stuff, then it's so easy for us to sin or to fall off the map. Because the reality is, Satan, he shows up to Adam and Eve, and he shows up to Jesus. Reality is, I don't know that Satan will, my guess is that he's probably not going to show up face to face and tempt us in that exact same way. And even if he did, he's not going to show up in a big furry snake costume and come up to you and say, hey, Travis, I'm about to tempt you, so just get ready, and then I'm going to ask you some questions and I'm going to tempt you. It doesn't happen that way. We're hit with temptation, and part of the reason we fail at temptation is because we don't even realize we're being tempted until long after we've completely messed up. I've thought about that with myself. I would be an expert at defeating trials that I go through if someone would just tell me on the front end that, hey, tomorrow you're going to be really, really tried, so you need to just make sure that you keep everything in check. But the immediate reaction when bad things happen so often is we let Satan turn that question so that we ask, where's God in all of this? When the question should be, where am I going to stand on this matter? And then finally, I think one other big application for us is, it goes back to that immediate gratification. There's no shortcuts to glory. Jesus knew this. He knew that there is no way to redemption except through the cross. Eve should have known this, and Adam. There's no way that they're going to become like God by disobeying God's commands. And for us, it's the same way. It's being a Christian can and will be hard, and there's difficult things that we go through. Anything in life, we live in a life of shortcuts with microwave dinners and Keurigs and Cliff Notes to help us through. But all of us realize that those things aren't as good as the real thing. If you just, a microwave, DiGiorno pizza is never as good as real actual pizza. But it's, whatever they say. And we realize that in life, and it's true with our spiritual lives as well. Anything worth having is worth going through difficult things for. And we see it in the Bible, we see it in our lives, and if we're going to go the path of Jesus, rather than the path of Adam and Eve, we recognize there's no shortcuts to glory. And so I'll close out there. I talked for a bit, and I know it's about to ring. Were there comments or questions or thoughts that people had?
In 1 Corinthians 10:13, we always have an escape to sin. Whatever motivates us to be obedient, we should always remember there's an escape from school attention.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
When Audrey mentioned numbers, I was thinking about 40, and there were 40 days of rain, there were 40 days exploring the promised land, 40 days before the temptation. But all of the people who were about to go through those 40 days, they weren't ready when it started, they didn't get a second chance. The doors of the ark were closed when it started to rain.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just thankful I live in the New Testament era instead of the Old Testament.
To say what?
I said I'm thankful we live in the New Testament era instead of the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's it definitely helps a lot. Seeing God's plan fully for what it is. Thank you very much for your time.